Hi, so as part of Careers Week, we've been speaking to a few of our alumni from a range of different careers and courses about various topics around careers and wellbeing. Today I'm speaking to author and emergency medicine physician, Cathy Wield. Cathy writes and speaks on mental health and wellbeing for doctors, and she's very active with the British Medical Association and sits on staff associate specialist and specialty doctor committees as well. So welcome, Cathy, and thanks so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I think we'll start by talking a bit about your role. So you've had a very varied role and you've faced a few personal challenges over the last few years. Could you tell us a bit about your experience and share any advice that you have for someone who's adjusting to changes in their career or adapting to any major life changes?
Of course. So, I suppose it would be quite helpful just to talk a bit about my pathway. I actually qualified from St George's in 1983. I had a baby, and at that time there was no facility to work part-time. It just wasn't going to happen. So I just went on and had my family, and I didn't actually enter medicine to do my pre-registration house jobs, as they were known at the time, until 1991. When I first started work, I thought that I would do general practice because it was the easiest option, I guess. I actually did a 6-month post in GP, and I really didn't enjoy it that much, and I really loved A&E. And just at that time, the flexible training had started. So I was offered a flexible trainee post to train to become an A&E consultant. Just before I took up that post, I was working full-time in A&E, and I went off sick. I became what was termed or diagnosed at that time as depressed, and it led to a 7-year episode, which was absolutely terrible, and that I've written about in the first book I had published. So I was away from my career for almost 8 years again. When I recovered, I came back to be an emergency medicine flexible trainee in 2002. And amazingly, I carried on. I did my exams, got appointed as an SPR, and then my husband was made redundant. And we ended up moving to Scotland. I tried to transfer my training up there, but things went horribly wrong, and I ended up taking a psychiatry staff grade, as it was known then, basically specialty doctor post. It was completely the wrong fit for me. So after a couple of years, I found out that I could not get back into A&E where I was living. So I actually just retired from work. I had another kind of mental crisis, I suppose. And I was advised that I should never work again. I should take high-dose medication for life. But there was a lot about me that just was not willing to accept that. And thankfully, I didn't. We moved back down south, and I took another job in A&E, and I felt so much more comfortable. This was really what I liked doing, what I knew most about. And I carried on with that until 2016, when we had the opportunity to move to the USA, to Denver in Colorado. I was a specialty doctor equivalent it was actually a trust registrar in the last post in A&E. And I felt at that stage that it wasn't going anywhere. I was really quite disappointed in my career. And I thought, well, okay, I'm happy to do my American exams and join A&E in Denver in Colorado. It didn't work out at all. I went over, I did my exams, I took them, I passed them, and then found out that there was a very, very small print asterisk when I came to apply for the residency posts, which you had to do to complete your license. And it said that you had to have been qualified within the last 5 years. So, having done all that work, paid for to do the exams, paid for the courses to be able to pass them all, I then found I wasn't able to do this final hurdle to work as a physician in the US. So I ended up working with the homeless, but in time, financially, we realized that this wasn't going to work. And so I actually returned with my husband, and I now work back in emergency medicine. I'm a specialty doctor in Yeovil. Actually, it's an interesting position to be in. I've returned to medicine, 3 or is it 4 times after quite a long period off. And you asked about what I would advise. And I would just say that actually our expectations when we're in medical school is to have a very linear career. We'll do foundation year, then we'll go into some other kind of training and end up as a GP or a consultant. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if for any reason you decide that this is not the right way for you, then I think it's perfectly okay to say, look, I'm going to do what I need to do. And this is not career suicide. I honestly have thought on several occasions that I would not be able to go back, and I did. Managing obstacles is something that you have to be prepared to do. Preparation involves making sure if you've had a time off sick that occupational health are going to agree to you working again. I got on both occasions after being ill, I had honorary contracts. So I actually basically was working without pay for a while until they realized that actually I wasn't that bad after all. And I was offered locum and then substantive posts. There are return to work courses now, of course, which is very helpful. I did online modules. I also did various life support courses. And I think the other thing is to be honest, because people are curious. They want to know why it is that you haven't done what most people do. And I had encountered quite a lot of suspicion, quite a lot of negative expectation of my abilities as a result of time off. But I just faced it head on. I said I was off with depression, but I'm determined to carry on. I'm determined to work hard. I'm not here to let anybody down, let alone myself. And obviously the second time round, in some ways it was harder because part of me had left voluntarily because I didn't like my career choice that I'd made. And then I wasn't able to get back into A&E in the place where I lived in Scotland. But again, once I came down to England and to the place where I lived, I went and I, met with the consultants in the A&E department there, told them my story, and they agreed to me having an honorary contract. I think a lot of the challenges for me have been around disappointment, because of what I wanted, and then having to actually manage my own sense of failure, which actually isn't failure. It's actually persistence and resilience. It's I've had some horrible things happen to me in my life, but actually each time I've got up, I've faced it, I've gone back. Now I think my challenge is actually managing my energy, because right now I'm incredibly busy. I'm working full time. I'm on the BMA on various committees. I'm writing yet another book. So I just have to be careful to really look after myself. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to talk a little bit about gender pay gap. And I think when you've spent part of your time working part-time, and you get to the end, towards the end of your career, you realize that actually your pension is not the equivalent of those of male colleagues. But I think particularly for SAS doctors, we've got a new contract that should be improving. The other thing is ageism. Obviously, we know it's illegal, but it's one thing to be illegal and it's another to actually face the fact that people can look at you and think, oh, actually, you're older, you're not as capable, you don't have as much left in you. But I think you can just prove them wrong. So
I think that's a really great, really honest account of your experience. It's been really interesting to hear a bit more about your career path and how you've overcome some huge challenges, some huge obstacles. You've spoken a bit about those challenges and what helps you manage some of these.
Well, I think obviously there's been quite a lot of risk taking in my life. I wrote about what's happened to me, and I realized sort of soon on, particularly the second time, the first time after I came back from the severe mental illness, that I didn't have anything to be ashamed of. And I had to really talk to myself about that and just carry on saying, this happened, but it can happen to anybody. I'm not different as a result of this. I'm not weak. And I have nothing to be ashamed of. And obviously, it's a risk when you put yourself out there. But in actual fact, I've used that, I suppose, to further my career, because it's given me a passion. It's given me a care for others who are in similar situations, patients and doctors.
And you've written about your experience in your books. So you've written Life After Darkness, A Doctor's Journey Through Severe Depression, and A Thorn in My Mind, Mental Illness, Stigma and the Church. And what was it like to write about these experiences? And can you tell me more about how you've worked to address the stigma of mental illness?
I guess the reason I wrote the first book was actually I was talking about my story with a group of GPs at that time who were called PRIME, which was Primary Mental Health Education. And one of them said, have you thought of writing a book? And I said no. And he just asked, if he could mention it to one or two people, and I agreed. And in fact, I was approached by 2 publishers in the same week before I'd even written anything. So in a way, it was very easy, because I actually had a book commissioned before I'd written it. So once I'd signed on the dotted line, I kind of thought, here goes. So that was slightly terrifying. I had no idea I would get the press that I did when it was published in 2006. So second time round, it was a bit easier. And the reason I wrote that was because at that stage in my life, I was going to church, and I realized that actually stigma was in general society, but in two places in particular, and that is in religious settings, not just Christian religion, but many religious settings, and also within medicine. So those were the two places that I really wanted to tackle. So I guess the passion behind that was thinking some pretty awful things happened to me, and I just don't want it to happen to anybody else. So that's okay. Obviously, I've said it's a risk doing anything. And I've also learnt with writing, with speaking, that it's quite important not to get stuck on what other people think about you. So I am not going to be reading reviews of when my next book comes out. I have found that when you write something, or whether it's looking at reviews which come via social media or anywhere else, you can have 100 good ones, and one bad one comes and it can just knock you off your perch, and you're like, oh, the whole world crumbles around you. So actually, this is all about how I feel about myself, and I do not really need to let in people who I don't know, strangers who just feel like they want to say something about you, whether it's good or bad.
I imagine it's quite a personal process writing a book as well. Does your new book follow a similar theme, or is it around a different theme?
The new book, I'm actually writing two. One is fiction, which is going to be completely different, but the other one is really looking back at that time, because I know now what I didn't know then, which was the reason why I was diagnosed with depression. I think actually it was all wrong, and that if I had have been listened to in the first place, I would not have ended up in this terrible situation of having, loads and loads of drugs, over 100 ECT treatments, and ended up actually having neurosurgery. So I really want to tackle what I see as medicalization of the normal. And the crisis I was going through at the very beginning was all to do with working 80 to 100 hours a week, looking after 4 children, and then having to deal with my eldest daughter, who had just got a place at the Royal Ballet School, which was boarding, which was where the trauma of my childhood occurred, at boarding school.
It must have all been really difficult. It's so interesting to hear you speak so honestly about it. I think it's really important to address some of these themes, and, like you say, remove some of that stigma around them as well. I'd like to go back to, because we'd spoken a bit about some of the challenges that you faced while you were changing careers and moving abroad. Obviously, you had quite a difficult experience with your move to Denver in 2016, but I was wondering if you'd have any advice for somebody who's considering a move overseas.
Definitely research it. I mean, I actually did a fair amount of research. There wasn't a lot in this country about those who'd moved to the USA. Lots and lots about Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And it's actually for good reason, because the USA are not so open to overseas medical graduates. When I ended up in Colorado, I'd actually, emailed, tried to meet with medical people over there already. And I hadn't understood just how much of a challenge it is to enter the medical system. Actually, I found out after I'd done all my exams that there was a charity dedicated to helping medical professionals from overseas get into work. And we're not talking about medicine, we're talking about work. Um, they said, just forget even trying in Colorado. They hadn't taken an overseas medical graduate for over 30 years. So obviously research and looking at the cost of it all in terms of finance, the way to apply, and having a plan B. I didn't have a plan B, but we had to rapidly make a plan B, and in the end, it meant that we actually ended up coming back to this country. And yet, even though I can look at it and say, "Oh, what a waste of time, money, and all the rest of it," we had a great time. I learned so much about myself, and I worked outside of medicine for a while. It was a valuable time.
Yeah, I think you can learn so much from living overseas because, I've done it myself, and it can be such an adjustment. But yeah, as you say, it can be really enriching, and it's good to hear from you how some of those processes for moving overseas can vary so much between different places. I think that will probably be quite useful for some of our recent graduates who are considering that move themselves. So thank you for that. And I'd like to just go back to the fact that you are in your current role now after living overseas, having a few career changes. And do you have any advice for someone returning to medicine or a healthcare role after a long period? You've touched on it slightly, but if you've got any tips that you think would really help with that adjustment period.
And I think for any major change, whether it's a return to medicine or a move, it's always plan it if you can. So do your research well. Be prepared to work hard. Be prepared to actually, revise what you know, so that you're able to interview well, for instance. What's the other things? I think just be brave. Step into whatever it is, and look for support. You're going to have hopefully friends, family, social networks that you've already have, and let them help you. Don't be put off if you think you've made a mistake, because I see life more or less as a journey, and you have choices whether to step off one road or take another path. It can be corrected if you get it wrong.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's been really insightful, and I think it shows as well, like you say, that your career isn't set in stone. You can change career paths and move back to the same career. And I think it's useful just to hear from you about your experience to show that it can be done. And I'd like to just talk finally, just to finish, a bit about support available to people in healthcare. So you've mentioned in previous conversations the Doctors Support Network. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Okay, so Doctors Support Network has been around for a long time, and I joined up with them after the first illness, not having known that they were around. It's actually mostly an online support. So anybody can sign up who's a doctor or a medical student. And there are various resources through the website. There are some grants for various things, but it is a support network. It's not providing therapy or mental health care. It's literally just putting you in touch with other people who've had problems with mental health. So at one point there were lots of local meetings, but that's obviously with COVID, that's completely stopped. But in many areas of the country, that doesn't happen. But I think there's a forum, you know, which you can go on, and it's confidential. But obviously other sources of support, sort of phone support coming from the BMA, all the mental health charities. There's a lot out there now, to be honest. Royal colleges, trust leads, and within hospitals for trainees, there's the Well and Resilient Doctors ward, which has just started in the last few years.
Great. So I think that's really helpful to have some advice from you and hear from you about your personal experience, but also I think there's some really good resources there that some of our students, some of our new graduates can hopefully tap into. So thanks again for speaking to me today, and really enjoyed our conversation, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.